These small squares, full of gorgeous texture, can be slow stitched in one sitting. You can make multiple squares in no time flat and have a beautiful stash to choose from. I'm going to show 2 different ways to create this all-over pattern and show how to combine this method with straight running stitches for an even more complex result. And I even stitch some spirals. I then show how I stitch the squares together to create a larger project. This method is not limited to squares. You can stitch rectangles or any other shape you like. Slow stitching is so relaxing because you don't have to think about following a complex pattern or worry about your stitches being perfect. It's all about free-flowing, relaxing creativity. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. The overall look of these 2 pieces is similar, but the way they were stitched was different. I'm going to start with this rusty colored piece and show how I stitched it. And then after that, I'll show how I stitched the blue one. I'm starting with a piece of solid colored fabric backed with felt. My batting is 3 by 3 inches. I'm using felt. And the fabric is about 4 by 4 inches. It's a scrap, so it's not precise, but that's the rough size of this piece of fabric. I'm going to use pearl cotton to stitch this. This is pearl cotton size 8. For that, I'm going to use a chenille needle size 24. You can also use a long darner number 1 or a milliner's needle size 1 or 3. I have 2 colors here that I'm looking at, an ecru and a golden color. I've decided to go with the ecru, and I'm going to start with this free-form running stitch. So I'm coming up in the middle, and I'm going to begin making running stitches, going up diagonally. And when I get to the corner, I'm going to turn and continue stitching. I don't have a plan about what direction I'm going to stitch. I'm loading up my needle, pulling the stitches through, and turning the fabric and continuing. This is a very relaxing process because there's very little thought going into where I'm stitching. I'm also not worried about the size of my stitches or keeping them uniform. I'm really just relaxing, turning my fabric and covering the surface with stitching. So here I've gone around a few times, and the stitching I've done has made an irregular pattern, and this is exactly what I'm looking for. And I'm just going to continue in this pattern. Now that I have some stitches down, I'm going to pay attention to the areas that aren't stitched and move towards those with my stitching. But aside from that, there's no plan except for covering the entire surface in stitching. Now I'm wearing a silicone thimble on my thumb, and that's because I want to protect it from being pricked by my needle as it's moving through. So wearing this thimble is an option. Sometimes I wear it and sometimes I don't. It really depends on the day and whether I want to have that protection on my thumb. This fabric and felt is very, very soft and easy to stitch through, so I don't need a thimble on my other hand. Now I'm getting to the end of this piece of thread, so I'm going to take a final stitch and pull the thread to the back and tie a knot. I'm going to clip that off. I'm going to thread up again and continue filling in these areas where there aren't any stitches. Here's an example where I did the same thing with this long strip of pale pink fabric using an orange-red thread. I stitched this while I was sitting outside, and I took some shots in process, and so I'm going to show those a little bit later. But this piece was completed in exactly the same way that I'm stitching here. So now I'm just paying attention to where there are some blank spots, turning my fabric and covering those areas. As I stitch, it gets more and more covered. The other thing that I'm paying attention to as I go is I'm looking at the stitches that are already there, and I'm paying attention to the direction. I don't want to create a pattern or line up stitches in a particular way. So when I have the opportunity to, I'm going to take a stitch that complements instead of lines up with the previous stitches. But again, I'm not worrying too much about this, just relaxing and continuing to stitch my way across the piece, back and forth, back and forth. I'm coming to the end of this thread, so I'm going to do the same thing and knot off. I'm going to thread up once more to cover any areas that haven't been covered at this point. So here this piece is completely covered in stitching. It really does look random. There's no pattern. The stitches are going in all different directions. It's exactly the effect that I was looking for. And before I move on to the blue piece that was completed in a different way than this, I want to show what I'm doing with this green piece of fabric. Another option for relaxing stitching without much thought is to mark lines on your piece. So I'm going to cut a piece of this golden pearl cotton. And in this case, I'm only going to mark one line, and that will give me a line of straight stitching, and I can use that to work off of in either direction. And I have a friction erasable pen. I'm going to draw a line on my fabric. I can bring the iron over to this when I'm finished with this line, and it will disappear. So I'm going to start at the end and take a stitch. And now my thread's secure. And now I can come up with either a running stitch or a stab stitch or a combination of both and cover that line with stitching. And when I get to the end of that line, I'm going to come up from the back a little ways down from that line, and I'm going to stitch another line parallel to that. And I'm following that line to create a straight pattern. You can do this across your entire piece. And now I'm turning to the blue piece of fabric, and I'm covering this with a seed stitch. I've already started here in the middle, and I'm moving out towards the edges. So instead of creating a random pattern, I started in the center. I just kept working my way out. The difference between the running stitch and the seed stitch is that with a seed stitch, you're taking one stitch at a time. It doesn't have to be in the same direction, and you can work on the top or you can pull your stitch from the front to the back. Either way is fine, but you're not trying to make one continuous stitch that goes in and out and in and out like you are with the running stitch. So I'm taking one stitch at a time, and then I'm turning and I'm going back and continuing to fill in the area. It's very similar to the way that I did that rusty orange piece with the ecru thread, but it's slightly different, and it's another really relaxing, enjoyable option as a way to cover a piece completely in stitching. So here I want to move along to an area that's blank, and so I'm taking a stitch in the back, traveling my thread, and bringing it out where I want it to be. And then I can continue filling in the area right up to the edges with these seed stitches. And here I've worked my way right out to the edges with all these stitches going in different directions. So now I can knot off my thread. And you can see on the back that as I began stitching, this piece of fabric shifted. Because I didn't baste it in place, it looks wonky, but that's okay, because I'm going to be folding back these edges, and there's enough fabric left on all the edges that I can tuck it under in my next step. So here are the two pieces that I have stitched that look very similar, and each method is slightly different. Both really enjoyable, and I'm happy with the effect that I've gotten with these. Here's the green piece that I began stitching with the marked line. You can see that I did a combination of running stitches that are straight and the seed stitches going in the different directions here. So there's 3 pieces stitched in a really relaxing process without much stress or thinking about where I'm going to place the stitches or what they're going to look like. It's a really nice effect. And now I'm working on this navy blue piece. I've begun with some straight lines of running stitches. I'm going to add a combination of straight stitches and uneven seed stitches like I had done here. I'm using the same blue color of pearl cotton that I had used on the lighter blue, and it's showing up differently on this navy blue. So here's what I'm talking about, the stitching that I'd done on this green piece, doing a combination of the straight running stitches and mixing it up with the uneven seed stitches. I'm going to do that same thing on this piece. So I'm adding some of these seed stitches, filling in that upper corner, and then I'm going to switch and do some more of the straight lines. And I don't have a plan. I'm just doing it by eye and switching to the different type of stitching when I feel like it's a good fit. Again, no stress here. Just doing what I feel like in the moment. And when you're doing these straight running stitches, you can take one stitch at a time if it makes sense for the design you're creating. You can also stack them up. And here it makes more sense to take them one stitch at a time so that I can line these stitches up and make these lines relatively straight. I like the way that this is looking. I'm going to continue to fill out all the areas, changing up my stitches. And now I'm going to show how I did this long piece, stitching outside, just relaxing and enjoying a beautiful day. This type of stitching is perfect when you just want to relax and not think about making your stitches perfect. So I've started with this really random uneven shape moving across the strip, and then I've rethreaded and I've done the same again. Oh, you can see some little feet moving across the top of the screen there. That's my little dog Aria, enjoying the outside as well. Now I'm going to thread up and do another round. I've concentrated on one end here, adding more stitches, and I just keep going as I sit and relax, threading up another round and adding more and more. It's starting to get more filled out here, getting fairly close to filling in all the areas. And here you can see on the right, it's very, very filled out. And I'm moving towards the left and filling out all those small areas. And here I've finished. I've stitched all over this piece. It's given this wonderful texture and effect. So now back to this navy blue piece where I filled in all the areas with the two types of stitching. It shows up more than it does on this green piece where the thread is a closer match to the fabric. So there's lots of options that you can get different looks just with color. Okay, and there's one other type of stitching I want to show that I've done here, and that's working in spirals. So I've started in the center. I haven't made any marks, I've just done it by eye, moving around and around, filling out this entire square with a spiral that moves from the center out. You could also use a pen and mark these circles if you prefer. Do whatever works for you. These ones I have done without any kind of marks or plan. On a couple of the pieces, I've changed my color of thread. That's an option too. And these are also really relaxing to stitch. And again, I haven't worried about perfectly spacing everything or even a perfectly sized circle. Somehow it works out if you start in the middle and you just continue to turn while you stitch, that the circle creates itself. So now I have quite a few pieces covered in stitching, and I want to start stitching them together. So I'm going to move around some pieces and see if I can come up with a combination that I like. And to do that, I lay out the pieces and continue to move them around. The way I'm going to stitch these together is to place them face to face. So I can take these edges and fold them under. I can also iron them or even baste them to keep them folded under. It depends on the fabric that you're working with, what will be best here. And then I will line them up so that the pieces of felt match corner to corner and use clips to hold them in place. I'm going to use regular sewing thread in a beige color to stitch these. You can use whatever stitch you prefer to connect these squares. I'm going to hold the edges together and I'm going to stitch straight through both pieces and pull my thread. So here are 4 squares that I have stitched together. If you look really closely, you can see that beige thread joining the pieces together. What I ended up doing with my edges is folding them under and basting them in place so that they would stay. And then I put right sides together and I stitched 2 and 2, and then I stitched those 2 to the other 2. And I matched up those center corners. I didn't worry too much about it being perfect or precise. My main goal was securing them together to create one piece of fabric. So depending on the project that you're making, you would add a backing to this after all your pieces are stitched together. This would be nice for a pillow cover. You could make a bag out of this. There's endless options about what you can do stitching these small squares together. They don't end up being exactly the same size because of the nature of stitching, but that's okay with me. This isn't about precision. I'm really happy with this project that's been so relaxing to do. Working on the small squares means you can accomplish something in a really short amount of time. So if you don't have a lot of time to stitch, you can just work on one square at a time and not worry about a bigger project. And once you have a whole bunch of squares, you can pick your favorite ones, stitch them together, and use them for a larger project. I hope this has given you some ideas about ways that you can stitch small squares without a plan and just enjoy the process, and maybe even later have some pieces you can use for a larger project. If you're looking for more slow stitching ideas or projects, check out my other videos linked below. There's lots of tutorials and inspiration for new and experienced stitchers. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you find time to relax and stitch and connect with your own sense of creativity. Until next time, happy stitching.